So let's talk through some of the strongest and weakest units from the Raiders of Commer, with a tier list ranking the datasheets in Index Drukhari. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today I thought we'd do a video focusing on the Dark Eldar, and talk through the datasheets in the Index in a rough tier list of current power in the game. In the not too distant past, Drukhari had a fairly major shake-up in the balanced data slate. Games Workshop was kind enough to give them a new detachment in the Sky Splinter Force, plus a bunch of handy points cuts, and between all that it seems to have got the faction into really quite a good place. The majority of units at least usable in game. Their iconic playstyle of Raiders jumping from transports is well supported, and it gained them a lot of strength as well, them sitting as a fairly good mid-tier faction, getting some tournament wins and success. In this video I thought I'd do a rough tier list of unit power in game for the Drukhari, sorting the units into 5 fairly arbitrary tiers for how I think they shape up against their peers right now. As ever with tier lists in Warhammer 40k, they can be a bit arbitrary. Some things could definitely be ranked a bit higher or lower depending on your given army and playstyle. Other things can definitely be big factors as well, such as player skill, what sort of environment you're playing in, whether it's more casual or cutthroat competitive, and which detachment you're using as well. I thought I'd mainly focus on the Sky Splinter Force, as that's the one that more people are using right now. That definitely makes a bigger difference to certain units, given that it really helps out anything that is a transport or jumps out of one. I did do a community poll as to unit strength on the channel to help guide with this a little bit, though I did certainly add in a fair few of my own insights and shift things up and down a little bit based on that, and particularly based on what other things are getting played at tournaments quite a bit recently. There's already a fair bit of data out there for what's actually winning games with the new Sky Splinter. I'm always happy to hear different opinions though, so feel free to let me know down in the comments if you think anything was too high or too low. In any case, let's jump right into it and go through the 5 different tiers of the Drukhari army, starting with the weakest and heading towards the strongest. First up in tier 5, I've just chosen to rank the Drukhari aircraft and the Hellions. With the current state of the army, I feel like they're just a little bit standout, unlikely to be taken. Starting with the aircraft, the Void Raven bomber is 215 points and the Raisin Wing jet fighter is 170. It does seem to be a general trend in 10th edition that Games Workshop really doesn't want aircraft to be standout for just about any faction. The core rules already punish them quite a bit, forcing them to start off the board, so these guys don't get to use their good movement characteristic until turn 3 earliest normally. They don't do most objectives, and they're sort of shoehorned into being beta strike gun turrets. Out of the two, the Void Raven packs some heavy anti-tank shots and some bombs. They were kind of strong before the update, but Games Workshop pushed up the points by a fair bit. The Raisin Wing was already lesser played when the Drukhari were very weak, swapping out the main big Void Lance for some anti-infantry missiles. Out of the two, despite the increased cost, I still likely rate the Void Raven as better than the Razor Wing if I had to take one. I feel like with the increased points cost and the limitations though, I'll be unlikely to want to take one compared with Ravagers or Scourges, which just seem to do the Dark Lance fire better now. The only other unit that I've chosen to rank all the way down in tier 5 are the Hellions, 85 points per 5 of them. These guys did go down in cost a little bit, but still feel a fair bit overcosted for what they should be. They move fast at 14 inches, get 2 wounds at toughness 4, but their melee attacks are maybe a little bit tame, being strength 4, AP 1 and damage 2. They just struggle to punch up against anything that's tougher than T4 or has any sort of high save. As an individual unit, they're also far pricier than Reavers, being 25 points more, so they'd get the nod for sort of cheap utility type role, and they also don't get any real support from the Sky Splinter, not being able to jump out of transports. As a result, I feel like they're perhaps one of the single most overshadowed units in the index, either needing to go down in points cost or get some sort of stat line boost. Moving on to tier 4, these are the units that I consider overshadowed, probably a bit more usable and interesting compared with the previous ones, though I'd still say that they're unlikely to crop up in too many competitive lists, at least compared with all the competition. First up, there's the Witch Succubus, who's now a very cheap character at 45 points, but I think she kind of needs to be. She gives her witches a sustained hits 1 and fights first if empowered, and gives her unit a few AP-2 attacks to contribute to the fight with her weapons. I feel like her main problem is though that her damage boost doesn't really help out witches against things that they need to punch up against. They're already fairly capable of handling light infantry, and she just makes them better at that. And the main issue is Lilith Hesperax, who for the extra 40 points is massively worth the upgrade for, at least if you're planning to charge a squad of 10 out of a raider or something. I feel like with witches not being standout in their own right without Lilith, The standard succubus is still going to be a unlikely sight on the board, even if she is very cheap. Next up, I've chosen to rank Urian Rakarth at 80 points here. I think he's an interesting character and could fit in quite well with a Talos heavy list. His main special rule is to heal Talos or Kronos or Rax for 3 wounds, potentially meaning that his squad can regenerate at a slightly alarming rate. He himself is really quite tough with his 4+ invulnerable and great feel no pain, and he regenerates and stands up from death when he's killed the first time, so he's just a fantastically hard model to kill if his retinue is slain, and attacks with a little bit of anti-infantry melee and a once per game Crucible of Malediction. I feel like he's interesting if you're building around a whole load of Talos. If you are running, say, 6 Talos on the board, then I would rate him higher, maybe tier 3 or perhaps 2. It does seem that maybe most people aren't building around mass Talos though as the core of their force, and while that's not the case, he's probably not going to be as useful as other choices. Still though, despite ranking him so low, I still think he's very interesting if you are using loads of Talos. Following from him, we have the generic Homunculus for 60 points. He gives his Rax a 4+ Feel No Pain, which I think would be so much more impactful if he could lead Grotesques. Feel No Pains are okay on 1 wound infantry, but not quite as standout. Otherwise, he has a -1 leadership aura, which I guess is okay if you're scrapping over objectives, and has a bunch of anti-infantry precision attacks. Every so often, I guess he might get very lucky and kill a character. Maybe he's not awful for a bunch of racks in a Venom and space is limited, but you want to add a bit more weight to the units, both with damage and defense. And he could bear enhancements as well if you've got a unit of racks that wants to have one in there. In general though, I still find him to be a pretty unexciting character really. Racks maybe being a bit more interesting for units that is kind of cheap. And at 12 points per model, I think that they're not quite at the point of being really standout durable, even with this guy along. Next up, for 85 points, we've got the Court of the Archon, which I certainly think is a really interesting unit, maybe just a bit of a weird one to play with practically. This little Xenos command squad grants you lethal hits for the unit and fights first, and gives them -1 to wound. Potentially all that could apply to a fairly big squad with an Archon in a Cabalite warrior squad, as they can join alongside him. It means that you get a unit with all sorts of different random weapon profiles and can do okay shooting and okay melee. There's maybe a bit odd and generalist perhaps, and a bit too big a unit to fit in most transports unless you have a Tantalus. Otherwise you could just run them with an Archon for a cheapish retinue. I feel like they're really going to compete with Incubi for that role though, given how threatening they are, particularly with the boost that you can get from Sky Splinter. Overall, I know I've ranked them kind of low here. I feel like they're not the first unit that I'd go to, but definitely pretty interesting, and I feel like a weird big on the board squad with Archons, Cabalites and these guys is actually going to be something that could cause some serious problems. Perhaps as a bit of a second wave to push back enemy things trying to score objectives. Finally, for the units I've chosen to rank in tier 4, we have the Grotesques, 90 points per 3 of them. These guys did drop in cost a bit. Their toughness 6 with 4 wounds with a 6+ invulnerable save and a 5+ feel no pain. At least fairly tanky for those 30 points there. They attack with their AP1 liquefy gun flamers, plus a bunch of strength 5 AP1 damage 2 melee. They also get a chance to fight in death. Overall, I feel like that adds up to a unit that can bully lighter things okay, that maybe isn't desperately stand out against anything with a high save or high toughness. I feel like at their current points cost, their durability isn't quite so epically stand out that they're enormously exciting with that either. Couple that with not fitting in transports particularly well and not having any leadership options, I feel like they're often going to get overlooked for other units at 90 points per 3. Though even with all those disadvantages, they're not unusable. You can still make their melee a bit more scary with pain tokens and the lance buff out of a transport. And I have seen one list so far that's done well with them at a tournament using several small units. I guess could be an interesting choice if you want something that can hit at least fairly hard in melee and then be more robust to the enemy counter-attack compared with some of the other Drukhari units. Moving up to tier 3, we're getting onto units that might well be cropping up in tournament armies a bit more now. These guys I'd rank as solid usable Drukhari units, but maybe just not completely stand out compared with other things. First up, for 60 points per 5 of them, there are the Racks, a nice and cheap battle line unit with objective control 2, and per individual model they're a little bit tougher than most with their toughness 4 and 5+ feel no pain. Though I do feel like given the war gear rules for them these days, you wind up paying the cost for quite a lot of fancy special weapons as well, which means they're not actually quite as tough per point as you might perhaps hope for. Those special weapons within the unit do mean that they're maybe more of a threat to medium infantry or heavy infantry, than they would have been otherwise at least, and they do get the chance to farm pain tokens if they kill any full units. Overall, they don't seem to be too bad if you're putting them in Venoms for cheap objective grabbers on the move, perhaps. And I guess in theory you could do the big mortal wound stratagem in the Sky Splinter with a big unit of 10 of them in a Raider. Overall, I feel like they're alright. I think I do slightly prefer Cabalites for objective grabbers flying around in skimmer transports though, and both Witches and Venoms can be fielded in small squads if you split them in half with Venoms. Talking of which, moving on to Witches, they're 90 points for a squad of 10 of them. Again, cheap battle line with high objective control, though very fragile to enemy shooting. They do get a 4+ invulnerable save in melee, but they will die pretty quickly to any sort of volume attacks. A squad of 10 hits with just over 30 strength 3, AP 1 and damage 1 attacks. Previously just a bit too niche to really be bothering with, but the Sky Splinter force did do quite well for them. Giving them Lance really helps them actually wound and stack some saves on top of things. And now that pain tokens give you an extra pip of AP in the fight phase, I feel like their damage output when given buffs gets to sort of adequate levels. I feel like overall they're still maybe a little bit underpowered if you just take them individually, though I think they're really quite good with Leader of Hesperax. I still kind of feel like without her they're a bit underwhelming just on a raw stats point of view. They can be good against their ideal targets. If they do get in amongst the enemy, they could force some desperate escape checks as well, which could be kind of big. At least adds one more element of disruption to them, even if they could be fairly easily killed in return. Finally, for the tier 3 units, I've chosen to rank Reavers here. I think realistically I could have ranked them at tier 2, they'd certainly be on the upper end of tier 3. I do genuinely think that they're a good unit. They're a very fast biker unit with a 16-inch move, and some of their weapons get the assault keyword as well, allowing them to advance and do actions and things, make them pretty great for jumping around doing secondary objectives of one sort or another. Objective control 2 per bike means that you actually have some good chance of stealing or contesting points, and they do have a bit of ranged and damage threat. Their heat lance is a fairly fearsome melter shot, and they can do some mortal wound flyby attacks, kind of handy to have in small numbers for utility, secondaries, move blocking and nuisance charges and things, or contesting primaries with something cheap and expendable in a pinch. As mentioned, I do think that they definitely have a role. I could have ranked them tier 2 if being generous. Moving into tier 2 now, and here are units that I'd consider really quite strong for the Drukhari, bringing some interesting things to the table. The Kronos for 50 points I think is genuinely a kind of underrated unit for the faction. For the very cheap 50 points, it ranks among some of the most durable units in the game. 50 points for 7 wounds at toughness 7 with a 3+ save, a 6+ invulnerable, and also a 5+ feel no pain. It's just incredibly big indeed. Pretty much nothing really kills them efficiently, and the things that will kill it easily, you're probably investing so many points in them that they're kind of wasted going after a 50-point unit. For their damage, they get 2d6 attacks at somewhat close range at strength 5, AP 1, and damage 1, which isn't too bad for putting some hurt on lighter enemy infantry units. And then they add to the damage output of the army by farming pain tokens on a 4+ if they're used on units nearby. Given that they don't really do much damage, you probably only want so many of them in an army. But I do feel like they're just very easy to include for pain tokens just being an annoying screening action or nuisance board presence. You could have them in the backfield to zone out enemy deep strikers, or just push them up into the midboard to make the enemy actually have to deal with their tough profile. Maybe doing nuisance charges on things that really don't want to be in combat but are unlikely to kill them in a round or two. Ideally farming any pain tokens along the way, adding to the damage of other units as you go along. I feel like at least having one in the army for 50 points for the pain token farming seems very good to me, and I could happily run several more. Next up, it's Horrific Pain Engine Brother. The Talos is 80 points, 1 or 2 per unit once more. Given that it's 30 points more than the Kronos for the same defensive profile, it's not quite as crazily standout durable, but even costing an extra 60% more, I'd still say it's got very solid toughness per point. Perhaps a fairly standard loadout being something like the Talos Gauntlet for the damage 3, the twin liquefy gun in the other arm, and perhaps a touch more flexibility on the top gun, maybe a haywire or a heat lance. I feel like if you want a frontline damage and defense type unit for the Drukhari that can take a punch and also give one, then they do pretty well for that. Running a whole bunch of pain engines was perhaps one of the stronger ways to play Drukhari prior to the Sky Splinter Force being added, and they only got cheaper since then. I do feel like maybe their main disadvantage is not having much synergy with that detachment. I do feel like their raw datasheet strength is pretty good, a fairly good deal for what they do. Next up, for 110 points, there's the Cabalite Warriors. Perhaps the most iconic troops of the Drukhari get the sticky objectives rule that works when they're inside raiders and venoms. Quite a good advantage to taking objectives, particularly for an army that might occasionally want to move on and press the attack. And they also just have a lot of bodies with objective control too, loads of special and heavy weapons, and they can choose whether to get out and get other buffs and things, or fire from safes within the Raider and Venom, making them a little bit more durable to counter-attack. Their shooting's maybe a bit mixed profile and a bit more generalist as opposed to just focus on destroying one thing, but they can get a lot of buffs to it. Things like ignored cover or sustained hits from the Sky Splinter. Having an Archon in with a pain token can give you 4 rerolls to hit and wound as well, which is rather brutal. I feel like maybe having 1 or 2 units divided up in some Raiders and Venoms is quite a nice way to take and hold some objectives, while maybe some of the more dangerous elite damage dealers go charging in to destroy the enemy. Next up, we've got the gun platform that is the Ravager, 115 points for 3 dart lance shots at strength 12, AP 3 and damage d6 plus 2, and they can get some inbuilt hit rerolls of 1 against things that have already taken at least some damage. Kind of nice that these gun skiffs are no longer just filling head and shoulders above most of the other rest of the index competitively, and now just have their place within the army but not being dominant, just a solid fast moving gun platform that can deep strike if needed. Nice to have 1 or 2 of them to help solve the problem that enemy tanks represent at range, maybe alongside some Scourges perhaps. The Beastmaster also seems to be a pretty common staple in Drukhari competitive lists, though like a few other units is waiting for some sort of plastic kit or updated model. The Beastmaster costs 105 points and comes with a 6 Beast pack, 3 Razor Wings, 1 Big Fiend and 2 Chimerae. For the cost they're actually maybe not too bad in the durability point of view. They do get 21 wounds total at toughness 4, which isn't awful I guess. Maybe the biggest advantage that they get is they move fast and can scout. They can scout forward 9 inches into the midfield, and then they have a 12-inch move after that. They absolutely could be awkward and disruptive to handle for the enemy army, getting first turn charges, or potentially doing really quite painful move blocks and keeping a bunch of enemy units tied in their own deployment zone, unable to move past the beast pack. Could be super annoying and stop enemies from reaching the objectives that they need to too early in the game. Their mixed melee profiles are quite nice for bullying lighter infantry units with low saves who will struggle to punch up too much. Drukhari is the Champion of Blades leader of the Incubi, 75 points and really quite a scary melee combatant, a bunch of attacks at damage 3 and usually with +1 to wound if he's leading Incubi. The buff that he gives his unit is a +1 to wound which keeps them dangerous. Perhaps that has diminished in value just a bit since the Sky Splinter Force came out, as they'll often be able to get that if they're charging out of a transport. I guess if they do get a second chance to strike against something different, then it keeps them nice and dangerous, particularly if you've got a pain token going on as well. Otherwise, he has once per game personal precision to hopefully be able to assassinate an enemy character, and gets a 2+ save with 5 wounds, so he's a little bit more durable than some. I guess perhaps his main competition are Archons to lead Incubi into combat, who I think do really well with them with the full wound rerolls, plus the ability to take enhancements. Finally, and one that have ranked towards the bottom of tier 2 is the Tantalus. The big Drukhari Forge World unit is 230 points. I feel like maybe I've been a bit generous putting it in tier 2, it might have been a tier 3. It definitely is a big scary unit that gets on well with Sky Splinter though. I did notice that someone had done rather well with one in a tournament recently. The bigger and chunkier Drukhari Skimmer is 18 wounds at toughness 10 with a 5+ invulnerable save, so a bit more resilient to damage than most, though I'd still not say a standout durable for the 230 points there. It's got some quite good general purpose damage dealing with 12 shots at strength 10, AP 2 and damage 2, mortal wound impact hits if it charges, and perhaps most interestingly a really big transport capacity, allowing you to transport say a 10-man squad and a 5-man squad. I guess you could get some efficient shooting out of it if it was loaded with Cabalites, plus you did a pain token for it. That could potentially be a lot of weapons re-rolling hits. I feel like with a unit with this many points in it though, you would need to play a bit cagey. Maybe not the easiest given that it's got a slightly bigger profile than most. And it's kind of nice that with quite a lot of the other Drukhari skimmers out there, they're maybe priced at a point where if they get exposed and do get shot down, it's not really that big of a problem as you've not lost that much. Finally though, moving on to tier 1, these are what I'd consider perhaps some of the very strongest units for Drukhari at the moment, often going to be at the heart of most competitive lists. First up, the unit that's perhaps most risen up in the world since the updates are the Incubi, 75 points per 5. Their standard melee stat line of 3 attacks at strength 4, AP 2 and damage 2 isn't really that standout, but the buffs that they can get on that is pretty immense now. Lance in the Sky Splinter, a pain token for hit rerolls and extra AP, and they most commonly seem to be fielded with an Archon for the reroll wound rolls if you do give them a pain token. And between rerolling hits, +1 to wound, and rerolling wound rolls, you're just going to be stacking a massive amount of saves, all at AP 3 and damage 2. With that very scary general purpose profile, they may be the most interesting unit for the move, drop and charge stratagem in the Sky Splinter. You could theoretically be getting charges from one deployment zone all the way to the next, and very reliably on things closer than that. I feel like you could run them either as 5-man squads or maybe a big 10-man squad. A 5-man squad with an Archon and those buffs would quite reliably destroy most normal sized units around. Going up to a 10-man squad means that you're a massive threat even to some of the tougher stuff in the game. Kind of hand in hand with the Incubi are the Archons. Perhaps the most iconic Drukhari HQ commander, gives you reroll 1s to wound, going up to full wound rerolls if you have a pain token going on. Great for the Incubi, and pretty nice just for standard Kabbalite warriors shooting as well. And he contributes with his own blast pistol and a bunch more AP 2 and damage 2 melee with his Huskblade. The Archon that you nominate as your warlord can increase the cost of a battle tactics stratagem by 1 CP for the opponent. Could be nice to annoy their command point reroll or something else powerful. And it's also very nice for bearing enhancements, such as the Ignores Overwatch one, which means that you could just stop an Incubi unit being interacted with at all before it gets to charge. That's really quite powerful. Or maybe if you've just got a few points left over, that Spiteful Raider one for pain token farming when you kill units. That could be very nice as well if you're in an Incubi squad. When he does get attacked, he's got a Shadow Field as well. The 2+ invulnerable save that fails on a 1 is definitely unreliable, but just occasionally you will just keep on rolling those 2+ for an unusual amount of time. It means that it's hard for your opponents to really budget to know how much firepower is needed to kill him. Overall, he does seem very nice, was perhaps the most commonly played HQ prior to the whole balance update, and since then I've seen a fair few lists that are choosing to run more than one. I've seen some running 3 with multiple units of Incubi. Next up, we have the Bat-winged anti-tank of the Drukhari in the Scourges. These guys are definitely priced at a premium for fairly easy infantry to kill. 110 points is a lot, but they do pack 4 Dark Lances, and they have just some fairly godly movement abilities. Jump infantry that move a massive 14 inches and then can move, shoot, move. And they can do that with really quite long range weapons as well, so they can potentially stay safe from things like enemy Overwatch that's 24 inches in range. Against armies that just have lots of direct fire things, they could just be really problematic. Jump out of cover, shoot you with a bunch of Dark Lances, and then jump back each turn. Unless the enemy's got things that can move fast enough to reach them, or deep strike, or do indirect fire things, they might really struggle to catch up with them. Later in the game, they could certainly switch to just being fast movement units to do objectives or maybe contest things. They've got great movement for that, and towards the end of the game, the damage output might not be the biggest thing. They're also understandably quite a popular unit for Inari as well, with the Battle Host rerolls, which really takes their damage to the next level. Overall, they do just seem to be a very strong unit right now, maybe even a little bit more so post-Data Slate when a lot of indirect fire things got nerfed. Definitely a unit that needs a bit of careful play though. You don't want them killed for a bit of trivial small arms fire if you can avoid it. Next up, a utility unit that seems to be present in just about every Drukhari list are the Mandrakes, 65 points per 5, and these guys are just good for screening and secondaries. They're a cheap infiltrating squad that can start on primaries in the mid-board or threaten things like first turn moves blocks or charges if you'd like. They do move quite fast when they're on the board at an 8-inch move, and they do have assault weapons so they can advance and do actions if necessary. They are quite easy to kill for the cost, but they at least have stealth and a 5+ invulnerable save to make them take a little bit more to take down, and they are fairly capable of deleting a similar sort of enemy unit in the midfield if they get the jump on them. 25 attacks at strength 5, AP 0 and damage 1 between their range and melee does threaten anything that's got low saves pretty well. Their special rule is their redeployment one, which means they can return to reserves by their fade away thing, and then return to the board to do secondary objectives. Really quite nice to have units that can jump on and off the board like that. Unless you desperately need them in the midfield to screen things turn 1, you could start them slightly further back and then just fade around the board, trying to do the secondaries and score the points as needed. Overall, a pretty amazing utility unit. They also seem to get played in Inari quite a lot, as the Eldari do have good utility units, but they generally tend to cost a bit more. Next up, we have the Drukhari skimmer transports themselves in the Raider and Venom. The Raider's 80 points and the Venom is 70. I feel like both of them are good enough to have a strong role in the army at the moment. Perhaps Venom's being a tiny bit more popular unless you really want a big 10-man unit all within the same transport. Perhaps a maxed out squad of witches with Lilith Hesperax. They are just kind of necessary to making the other units work, and doubly so given that the Sky Splinter Force has pretty much all its rules around supporting Drukhari Transport Assault, given that it's just a massively transport-focused attachment and also the strongest way to play. The transport units really are going to be the backbone of the army. Both of the skimmers are very fast with a 14-inch move, have firing decks so all occupants can fire out for a little bit of extra shooting, and they also both gained a bit by the FAQ that allowed Deep Strike to confirm to work with disembarking, so you can Deep Strike them onto the board and get the squad out. Kind of fun to have them work as sort of Drukhari drop pods now. For the 80 points, the Raider gets more wounds and more transport capacity, plus a big Dark Lance, which is never a bad thing. Maybe particularly nice for 10 Incubi with an Archon or 10 Witches with Lilith. The Venom's cheaper, but has fewer wounds and a smaller transport capacity, though it does get stealth at least. It can split units in half for small efficient objective grabbing squads, maybe halves of Kabbalite warrior squads, or 5 Incubi with an Archon in there. It does also get the fun rule to allow units to re-embark at the end of a fight phase as well. Really quite powerful in the Sky Splinter, as if your units do survive any enemy counterattacks, they can jump back in to do the whole transport thing and go again, maybe with the Lance keyword or ignores cover, or the stratagem to allow you to move, disembark and then charge. Overall pretty cool units to the army. Nice to see the Drukhari iconic way to play is going strong. Finally, last but by no means least, we have Lilith Hesperax herself. The pinnacle of Drukhari arena combat actually makes the witches genuinely dangerous against things that aren't just lighter infantry. Her buffs to them give them an extra pip of strength to strength 4, an extra AP to AP -2. Then combine that with the extra -1 to wounds and a pain token for more hits and more AP, and they start to become far more threatening to far more units. A unit of 10 with Lilith is pretty lethal. Her personal melee is fairly impressive as well, either 8 or 12 attacks at strength 4, AP 3 and damage 1 after her own buffs, with anti-infantry 2+ and sustained hits. If all the buffs are active, then you'd average around about 40 attacks for her witch unit, wounding things like toughness 7 on a 4+, and all at AP -3. Not bad for around 175 points. She also grants fights first as well for the counter attack, and is a great unit to use that move, disembark and charge stratagem, potentially getting very reliable charges off from a long way across the table, just hopefully doesn't want to take too many casualties to Overwatch on the way in. With lots of scary stuff in the top tier talked about, that just about brings us to the end of a quick talk through Drukhari units in 10th edition. Let me know what you think down in the comments below. Look forward to hearing any other insights as to the units talked about and which ones have been performing well for you on the tabletop so far. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics. I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming. I do tend to post new ones just about every day. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked in the video description down below. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with the chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.